Good morning, Bio 2. I'm recording this supplemental lecture from my home because my daughter's sick. So if you hear her in the back by talking today about producers, they often serve as kind of the base of many animals' food chains. Possibly most importantly, variations in the abundance of plants over time and their colonization of land has resulted in changes in our very own atmosphere in terms of the amounts of oxygen and CO2 in the atmosphere, which kind of lays the foundation for our own colonization of land as animals. Beyond that, plant roots help kind of provide greater structure to soil and prevent erosion. When plants die, that decaying vegetation adds to the soil and the total nutrients within it. And then even from an economic standpoint, plant remains form coal, which we use for energy. So although plants evolved close to around 450 to 500 million years ago, it took a couple 100 million years before they would colonize land. And so as we walk through this lecture, you'll see what the challenges of land colonization were and how plants, as well as fungi, overcame these challenges. So looking at the phylogenetic history of plants, we're pretty confident that plants evolved from green algae, also known as charophytes. Charophyte gets broken down into the Latin word chara, meaning actually just an unknown type of root, and phyte, which is like a plant or plant-like organism. And so, yeah, charophyte is another term for green algae, which we know now are protists. Now, there are a few reasons why we can be confident that plants evolved from green algae. First of all, common present-day green algae and plants share a lot of distinctive traits with one another. And this highlights the idea and the fact that they are the closest living relatives of plants. So for example, the cells of both plants and green algae have these distinctive kind of circular rings of proteins embedded in their plasma membrane. And these proteins help to synthesize the cellulose that's found in the cell walls of both green algae and in plants. Similarly, in species of plants and algae, both of these organisms have flagellated sperm. There are also a couple of examples that I don't think are necessarily covered in the textbook itself. And those are that they both develop what are called peroxisome enzymes, and they can both form what's called a phragmoplast. A phragmoplast is just this fancy word for what's formed when two cells separate from one another. Now, we consider plants to be a monophyletic group because all plants share a common ancestor. And in this figure, you can see how they're related to the different types of algae. And based on this phylogeny, you can see that the closest relative of plants are, again, those charophytes or green algae. From this, you can also see that, as algae are protists, plants essentially evolved from the protist group, and specifically this ancestral algae group. So it took a lot of effort to develop this ability to first colonize land. To colonize land, there were a few hurdles that had to be jumped. One of these hurdles involved keeping the organism from completely drying up. And in charophytes, just like in plants, there's a layer called the sporopollenin, which prevents zygotes from drying up. And this is similar to the spore walls that are found on plants. So this is one hurdle eliminated, this prevention of drying up. From there, though, new challenges would arise, the two main ones being this scarcity of water, as well as a need and lack of structural support. In the water, you can be this sort of free-floating organism, but travel and supporting yourself upright isn't as straightforward on land and air as it is in water. But it wasn't all challenges once plants got onto land. They were able to exploit the resources on land and take advantage of some of its benefits as well. So for example, they were now able to get pure unfiltered sunlight. They were also able to get more plentiful CO2, which they required to live, as well as this escape from harmful herbivores and pathogens that dominated the ocean waters. This was sort of an escape from all of that. So it wasn't all bad. Now we can look at some derived traits of plants and see what distinguishes plants from their ancestors, such as those algal protists. Some of these derived traits were key in allowing plants to thrive and colonize land. So for example, the cuticle and stomata are two traits found in plants, but not other organisms. And these help in keeping water within the plant organism. Other traits help them thrive on land for other reasons, such as the development of apical meristems, which are found at, first of all, the tips of most plants and allow them to keep growing up. And they're also found on the tips of roots, which allow them to grow outwards into the soil. We already mentioned the walled spores produced in sporangia, which help prevent exposed zygotes from drying up. And then one of the key traits of plants is this idea of what's called the alternation of generations. So plants essentially alternate between two multicellular stages. And that's what we refer to as this alternation of generations. And the two main stages that the plant experiences are the gametophyte and sporophyte stages. And what's important to know about these two stages is that in one stage, the gametophytes, the plant is in this haploid stage, meaning it has just one pair of chromosomes, and it produces haploid gametes through mitosis. And then in the second stage, we have the sporophyte. This refers to the fusion of those haploid gametes, producing a diploid organism, or having two pairs of each chromosome. We can kind of see this cycle completed when the sporophyte undergoes meiosis, producing haploid spores yet again. And then it becomes the gametophyte, and it keeps going ad infinitum from there. So I know with this idea of the alternation of generations and looking at plant life cycles, naturally what comes with it is this sort of influx of vocabulary terms. And I won't flood you with all of those terms in this supplemental lecture, but I do want to just touch on a few key terms. So continuing with this background on sporangia and sporophytes and how these were key in preventing water loss in plants, the sporophyte, that diploid organism, produces spores, and it produces them in these organs called sporangia. Within the sporangia, diploid cells called sporocytes are the cells that are actually undergoing the meiosis to make these haploid spores, which enter that haploid phase of the life cycle, which we saw back here. So within the sporophyte, there's a specific organ called the sporangia. Within the sporangia, there's the sporocyte, and then the sporocyte makes the actual spore. So lots of spores, I know, but try to be able to differentiate between sporophyte, sporangia, sporocyte, and spore. So you can kind of see that visually here in the example of this moss. And if you take the Bio2 lab, you should know from this week's lab that the main structure of moss, so whenever you're looking at moss, on a rock or anything, we all love to look at moss. The actual greenage that you see is actually the gametophyte, the haploid stage of this life cycle. The diploid phase comprises of just this tiny extension of the gametophytes called the sporophyte. And here you can see some of those terms we just went over, like the sporangium, which is just the casing at the tip here, this essential shell where within the sporangium, haploid spores are made by those diploid sporocytes. Now, the flip side of the sporangia are the gametangia. And just like sporangia make spores, gametangia are structures where gametes are made. And at this point, we can distinguish between female and male gametangia. So female gametangia are called archegonia, and this is where eggs are made. And this is the primary site where fertilization occurs. So think of it as the female reproductive organ for this liverwort in this example. Male gametangia, on the flip side, are called antheridia. And this is where the sperm are created. And once the sperm makes its way to the archegonia, it can actually from here swim to reach the egg, also known as the ovum. So plants developed all these cool traits that help them colonize land, but it's entirely possible that they could not have colonized land without the help of fungi. In fact, some researchers believe that fungi may have colonized land long before plants. You see, early land plants didn't have the roots or leaves necessary to give them structure and soil or absorb all that unfiltered sunlight. These are, characteristics that they eventually evolved once on land. And so symbiotic associations between fungi and land plants may have been necessary in order for plants to successfully live on land. And so if these symbiotic associations between the fungi and the plants, what are called mycorrhizae, if those were necessary for plants to colonize land, then perhaps fungi got there first. So one important thing to note is that even though we often associate plants and fungi, things like mushrooms, as these very similar organisms, perhaps because of the fact that they sometimes may look a little similar, or the fact that both have adopted this immobile life strategy. So, even though we kind of sometimes group them as similar, in reality, it's important to note that fungi are actually more closely related, genetically speaking, to animals than they are to land plants. So with this new kingdom, the fungi, come more vocabulary terms, just like we saw with plants. And there are a bunch of traits that make fungi unique, and just a few of them we'll go over today. So for example, fungal cell walls contain chitin, whereas plant cell walls contain cellulose. Fungi contain chitin, which is this strong but still flexible structure. Fungi come in a wide variety of forms, from single-celled yeast to these long thread-like multicellular filaments to the mushrooms that you're all familiar with. And fungi have also adopted and evolved a large number of structures that help them to absorb nutrients, just like plants kind of did. The most relevant structures of these are mycelia, or mycelium in the singular term. And what's important to note about mycelium is that mycelium is a collection of hyphae. So when you're looking at a diagram here, hyphae are all these little branches, and the collection of branches, or hyphae, forms the mycelium. Now, when you think of a fungus, you're probably thinking, often of a mushroom, especially that part that we eat. But what's important to note is that this is just part of the whole organism. It's really just the reproductive structure of the fungus, and within the soil lies the entire other half of this organism, something that we don't always think about. These soil-dwelling structures, the mycelia, are actually the part of the fungus that forms this mycorrhiza. Remember, this symbiotic relationship between fungi and plants, and it forms it specifically with the plant roots. And in this sense, the sense of this symbiotic relationship, we can classify fungi depending on the way that they form this connection with the plants. There are ectomycorrhizal fungi, which are kind of much kinder and form connections by growing into these extracellular spaces of the root. In other words, They find all the nooks and crannies where cells aren't, all these areas between cells of plants, and kind of connect to the plant that way. And then there are what are called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which extend um, their hyphae straight through the plant cells and go inside the plant cell. So, there's no going around the cells in this case. They kind of just burst their way into the cells and connect to the plant that way. So make sure you know the difference between these two terms, especially maybe for Friday. This difference between ectomycorrhizal and arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So for now, I'll leave this here because I know I've already kind of thrown a lot of vocab terms your way, but I hope this helps clear up some of the concepts behind some of these terms. And hopefully it helps you fill out the rest of the reading guide and prepare for the prep quiz where you'll likely see a few of these terms pop up. Otherwise, I will see y'all on Friday. Thanks.